Today's video shares two true stories that highlight the terrifying realities of caving in tight claustrophobic spaces. The first story is a gripping account of an intense and suffocating experience in an underground shaft. The second story takes place in 2003, when a group of cavers tried to navigate one of the most twisted and narrow passage ever explored. A space so tight, it pushes the limits of what the human body can endure. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of February 11th, 1998, a sharp cold filled the Tennessee woods as James Lewis, Alan England, Darrell Moore, and Jerry Olson prepared for a caving expedition. Olson had discovered a cave during a ridge walk and invited his experienced friends to join him in exploring it. The cave, locally known as Weatherly Well, immediately presented a challenge. The entrance was a narrow, 9-inch wide slot that dropped 4 feet down, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. At the bottom, it opened into a 7-foot drop, followed by another 10-foot drop into a larger passage. The group gathered at the entrance, peering into the tight, damp opening that seemed to pull them into the earth. From above, they could see the steep drop into darkness, the passage twisting sharply. It was an intimidating sight, with little margin for error. Even for experienced cavers, this was no simple task. They carefully organized their gear, checking ropes and safety lines. The narrow slot meant only one person could enter at a time. Alan England, 63 but still fit, and the smallest of the group, volunteered to go first. With a rope secured above as a safety line, he prepared to descend into the cave's tight, shadowy depths. The others watched, aware that this was only the start of what could be a difficult and risky exploration. England got ready to lower himself into the narrow slot, just 9 inches wide. Even for someone as small as he was, it was a challenging task. He took a deep breath and began to twist his body, feeling his ribs press against the tight space as he squeezed through. Each movement was difficult, the unyielding rock scraping against him, and his clothes caught on the damp, slippery walls. By the time he made it through, his shirt and pants were soaked, and he was breathing heavily from the effort. The next part was easier. Gravity helped as he used the rope to lower himself down a 7-foot drop into a slightly wider passage. For the first time, he could stretch his cramped limbs. His headlamp illuminated the next section, another 10-foot drop leading deeper into the cave. England paused for a moment, taking in the silence. His headlamp revealed a maze of twisting passages and sudden drops. He wanted to explore further, but going alone was too risky. The 10-foot drop would require more rope work, and without a partner to assist, it was too dangerous. Reluctantly, he decided to turn back. His clothes were damp from the cave's moisture, and the chill was starting to set in. He knew better than to push his luck. Climbing back up the 7-foot drop was manageable. His years of experience made it easier. He grabbed the rope, found footholds, and pulled himself up, step by step. Soon, he was back at the base of the slot entrance. But then the real challenge became clear. Going down had been easier with gravity assisting him, but climbing back up was a different story. England looked up at the narrow slot, which now seemed even tighter from below. He positioned himself and began to climb, using the rope for support. However, as he reached the slot, he got stuck. The tight walls pressed against him, leaving almost no room to move. His muscles, already tired from the cold and physical effort, strained to push him through. Gravity, which had helped him on the way down, now worked against him. He twisted and pulled, trying to force his way up, but the slot was too narrow. Each attempt left him more exhausted. His wet clothes clung to him, making every movement harder. England was trapped, and the cave wasn't making it easy for him to escape. From above, Lewis and Moore could see England struggling. They tried pulling on the rope to help, but the slot was so tight that every tug only wedged him deeper into the rock. England yelled at the guys, explaining that their efforts were only making things worse, which left them unsure of what to do next. England's strength was fading quickly. His hands shook from the cold and exhaustion, and the reality of being trapped began to set in. The slot was unyielding, the rock pressing tightly against England like a vice. The cave was cold, and the winter air flowing in from the entrance made it even chillier. England's soaked clothes clung to him, sapping what little warmth he had left. He shivered intensely, his breathing shallow and strained. The tight walls made it difficult to take a full breath, leaving him feeling as though the cave was slowly suffocating him. Lewis and Olson did their best to help. They lowered extra clothing and a thermos of warm liquid, hoping it would give England some relief. He forced himself to drink, trying to combat the cold, but it wasn't enough. Finally, England called out, his voice weak but clear. He couldn't keep going. They needed to get help, and quickly. Lewis and Olson acted immediately. They hiked back to Olson's house and called the East Tennessee Cave Rescue Team. Within 2 hours, the rescuers arrived, a team of experienced professionals equipped with specialized gear. By the time they reached England, he had been stuck for nearly 5 hours. His skin was pale, and his body shook uncontrollably from the cold. The pain was constant, a stark reminder of how dire the situation had become. His mind kept replaying the moment he had slipped through the slot so easily, with gravity aiding him effortlessly. Now, that same force was working against him, holding him trapped in the cave's icy grasp. The rescuers quickly assessed England's condition, wrapping him in extra layers and encouraging him to eat and drink to combat the hypothermia. The main challenge, however, was the narrow slot. England's position, combined with the tight, jagged entrance, left almost no room to maneuver. The rescuers set up a system of pulleys and hauling equipment, carefully designed to extract him without causing further injury. Each pull was slow and deliberate. England gritted his teeth as the cold rock pressed into his chest and shoulders, scraping his skin with every movement. The rescuers worked methodically, each action calculated to minimize harm. After an hour of intense effort, England was finally freed from the slot, battered and exhausted but alive. The cold air outside was a welcome change from the damp chill of the cave. Shaking from exhaustion and cold, England was helped to his feet. Despite his condition, he insisted on walking to the car on his own, showing his determination. Reflecting on the experience, England acknowledged he had underestimated the difficulty of exiting the cave. The tight walls had made it nearly impossible to use his gear effectively, leaving him entirely reliant on the rescuers for his survival. The next story is about a 180-degree twist in a passage that cavers should have never entered. On December 27, 2003, 8 friends from the San Antonio Boy Village, accompanied by 2 counselors, headed to Boy Scout Cave in Florida. Among the group were Michael Shiro, 15, and Javik Henderson, 16, 2 adventurous teenagers eager to explore the cave's network of narrow passages. The counselors decided to stay behind, concerned that their larger size might make it difficult to navigate the cave's tight spaces. Boy Scout Cave was famous for its maze-like tunnels and sharp turns, but it was generally considered safe due to its solid structure and dry interior. The boys started their descent just after noon, sharing 9 flashlights among them. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped to a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, the counselors stayed near the entrance, building a small campfire to keep warm. Michael and Henderson took the lead, guiding the group further into the cave. The air grew heavier, making it harder to breathe, and the only sounds were their own movements as they crawled through the narrow tunnels. Despite the cave's reputation for stability, the tight, twisting paths made everyone uneasy. With each step, the darkness seemed to close in. About an hour into their exploration, they reached a tough section of the cave called the Hairpin Curve. The group paused, unsure of how to proceed. Without the counselors who stayed behind, the boys felt the weight of their absence. They could have used their guidance and strength in this difficult situation. Michael, determined to lead, pushed forward into the Hairpin Curve. The passage was a tight, narrow slit in the rock, twisting sharply at nearly 180 degrees. It was only wide enough for one person to crawl through at a time. The walls were rough and damp, scraping against anyone who passed. Small rocks littered the uneven floor, and the low ceiling forced Michael to twist and squeeze his body to move forward. Michael reassured the group that if he was not able to pass, he would push back, and no one else would proceed without the counselors. Michael managed to squeeze through the narrow passage while Henderson followed right behind him. Henderson twisted and turned his body, struggling to fit through the sharp bend. Then he froze. He couldn't move forward or backward. Panic set in as his breathing became rapid. He was stuck, completely trapped, and he understood it. Michael noticed Henderson struggling and immediately moved to help. The rest of the group waited nervously in the wider section, their anxious whispers echoing in the narrow passage. Michael crawled back and forced himself into the cramped space beside Henderson, The rough limestone walls pressed against their bodies, scraping their skin as they fought to move. The cave's eerie silence was soon filled with panicked breaths and muffled shouts as Michael desperately tried to free his friend. The effort to move was exhausting, and the tight space made every action a struggle. Henderson's body was twisted awkwardly, stuck between the rough cave walls. The sharp edges of the rock dug into his ribs and hips, causing intense pain with every movement. His arms and legs were bent in uncomfortable positions, pressed hard against the unyielding stone. The cave's narrow walls made it feel like it was closing in, making it harder and harder to breathe or move. As time passed, the minutes felt longer and heavier. Michael began to feel the cold seeping into his body, even though the cave wasn't extremely cold. The limestone walls were icy to the touch, and their lack of movement made it harder to stay warm. Then suddenly Michael's vision blurred, and his arms and legs grew weak as he continued trying to free Henderson. One moment he was pushing with all his strength. The next, he collapsed, his body going limp against the narrow cave walls. Henderson's heart pounded as he saw Michael go still. He was trapped, unable to move, and now his friend was unconscious. He shouted for help, his voice echoing through the cave, but the sound only emphasized how dire the situation was. The other boys, waiting in the wider section, heard his cries and quickly became frantic. Their flashlights flickered as the batteries died, casting uneven shadows that added to the tension. It became clear they were in over their heads. Michael was unconscious, Henderson was stuck, and their initial confidence turned to fear. The air seemed heavier, making it harder to breathe, and some of the boys began to panic, worried that the fire outside was using up all the oxygen. They argued, their voices shaky, but eventually agreed they had to leave. Staying put risked everyone's safety, but abandoning Michael and Henderson felt wrong. With no other choice, they decided to crawl back to the entrance to call for help. Time was critical, and the decision weighed on them as they moved, hoping they weren't already too late. Outside, the counselors were unaware of the crisis unfolding in the cave. When the boys finally emerged, breathless and visibly shaken, they struggled to explain what had happened. The counselors, realizing the severity of the situation, quickly put out the fire. One called 911, while the other tried to calm the frightened boys. Rescue teams arrived within an hour, but they knew the mission would be difficult. Boy Scout Cave's narrow, twisting passages were challenging, and the heavy equipment made movement even harder. Concerns about low oxygen levels added urgency, pushing the rescuers to work quickly. Inside the cave, the remaining boys were visibly distressed, pale, shaking, and convinced they were running out of air. The rescuers found them huddled together, their faces marked by fear and tears. After checking, the rescuers confirmed oxygen levels still within normal level, easing some of the panic. However, Michael and Henderson were still in grave danger, and the focus shifted to rescuing them. The rescue operation began in earnest. Teams navigated the narrow passages, carrying harnesses, chisels, and other essential gear. Moving forward was slow and difficult, as the cave's tight spaces made progress challenging. Time was critical, and the rescuers pressed on, aware that every moment counted in the effort to save Michael and Henderson. When they reached the hairpin curve, the situation was grim. Henderson was conscious but struggling, his face pale, his skin cold and damp with sweat. His hands shook, and his speech was slow and unclear. Just ahead, Michael lay motionless, unresponsive. The rescuers knew they were up against the clock. Despite the cave's steady 72-degree temperature, the cold rock had drained the boy's body heat, and hypothermia was setting in. Henderson could barely move, and Michael's weak, shallow breathing signaled he was in critical condition. The rescuers worked swiftly but methodically, assessing the situation before taking action. They used chisels to chip away at the rock, each strike echoing in the confined space. The narrow walls forced them to twist and contort their bodies, making the work exhausting. Despite the difficulty, they continued, focused on freeing the boys. After more than an hour of intense effort, the rescuers finally freed Henderson. As they pulled him out, he let out a shaky sigh of relief, though his body remained stiff and shivered uncontrollably. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and began the slow, difficult task of guiding him through the tight passages toward the surface. With Henderson safe, the rescuers turned their full attention to Michael. His condition was critical, and his unresponsive state underscored the urgency of the situation. The rescuers worked faster now, chiseling at the rock with focused determination. Each second felt drawn out as they labored to create enough space to free him. The cave's tight walls resisted their efforts, but they refused to give up. Nearly 2 hours later, they finally freed Michael. His body was cold to the touch, and his pulse was weak but detectable. They secured him in a harness and began the arduous journey back to the surface. The narrow passages forced them to twist and maneuver carefully, their muscles straining as they carried Michael through the maze-like cave. Despite the physical toll and the cave's relentless obstacles, they pressed on, determined to bring him to safety. When they finally reached the surface, the scene was a blend of relief and urgency. Emergency medical teams were on standby and immediately took over. Michael and Henderson were rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to warm their bodies and stabilize their conditions. Both boys survived, but the hypothermia had left them severely weakened. For Michael, it took a full day to regain consciousness as his body gradually recovered from the ordeal. Reflecting on the incident, the counselor's choice to stay outside the cave, though made with good intentions, had left the boys without crucial guidance. Lacking proper equipment and preparation, what was meant to be a straightforward exploration turned into a dangerous situation. The event served as a stark reminder of how quickly things can escalate, particularly in the unpredictable and confined environment of a cave.